what to feed your wild discus. This is a question that quite a lot of first-time wild discus keepers might have. Wild discus are generally presented online on YouTube and in the fish keeping literature as more demanding, delicate and more picky than captive bred discus. Well, I would say that when it comes to feeding, I will have a separate video about how to take care of your wild discus. When it comes to feeding, wild discus are actually much easier to feed than captive bred discus. So there are a few things that you need to consider when you're thinking about a diet for your wild discus. First, whether you have an adult fish or a juvenile fish. In my case, I have here juvenile wild red spotted green discus. They are still, it's hard to say what age they are because they're wild caught and we never exactly know the age of wild caught fish, but I would say they're probably about 5 or 6 months old, but that's just a wild guess. And they're certainly not fully grown. They do not have full coloration of adults. They don't even have green colors. They have some red spots coming up, but you can't really see them well. So they still have a lot to grow and they still need to gain their coloration. So if you have a younger fish, which is probably harder to find when it comes to wild discus, because very often we only have adults for sale. But if you do have a younger fish, you need to consider a slightly more rigorous and intensive feeding schedule, and you also need to think about color enhancing foods if you want their colors to pop up. That mostly, in most cases, you will need flakes or granules that will enhance red colors, because most of the, well, many wild discus strains they have outstanding red colors, especially Allen Kerr, lots of different Haeckel variants and lots of different variants of brown discus as well as green discus. They need lots of red colors to come up. So if you have juveniles, you need to focus on developing these colors along with providing a diet that will be adequate for them to grow fast and efficiently and not to get stunted. When we talk about captive bred discus, whether it's European Stenker or discus from various Asian suppliers, breeders, most of these fish have been raised on various sorts of beef heart or seafood mixes, mostly beef heart mixes, and this is what they have been fed throughout their entire short lives. And it would be really hard to wean them off this food. So if you buy captive bred, most likely you will have to go with the beef heart mix that they used to. It's completely different with wild discus, because in the nature these fish were detritivores and insectivores. So they feed off detritus, they eat detritus, they eat various insects. They're also seasonal feeders. During the rainy season they would have more insects and they would have more other types of food, for example carnivorous element in their food. During the dry season their diet will be more limited and they will be feeding mostly off the detritus. So they're quite versatile and they're quite used to different diets and to feeding on different things. They're not limited to one particular type of diet, such as, for example, captive bred discus, especially Stenker discus, which will not eat anything except Stenker good heart until you spend a lot of time to wean them onto other foods. But going back to wild discus, I can say with 100% certainty that all wild discus exporters in Brazil and Peru feed their newly caught wild fish only with flakes and pellets. If you follow on Facebook, for example, Santarém discus, which is one of the largest wild discus exporters in Brazil, and also HEK discus, H-E-K discus by Hudson Crisanto, they feed their wild fish only with flakes and granules, so they do not provide them some sort of a fancy beef heart mixes and so on. So most likely when you will buy this fish will already be used to flakes and granules and all sorts of dry foods. And if you followed my channel, you would probably notice that I prefer to feed all my fish, not only discus but also altum angels and plecos and all other sort of fish, with dry foods as a staple? Well, the reason being is that dry foods provide far more balanced diet than lots of these homemade recipes. I will have a separate video discussing in depth benefits of commercial foods, and I will not be advertising any particular brand, commercial foods as a whole over homemade recipes, but that will be a separate topic because it's going to be a long discussion. But in any case, I prefer my fish to feed on dry foods as a staple. So I would feed them dry foods mostly in the morning, because in the morning they're the hungriest and they would basically grab anything, so I can practice with different types of dry foods. So right now I'm feeding my Discus with Tetra Color crisps. Again, I'm not advertising this. There are lots of other top quality color enhancing flakes and crisps and pellets on the market. So this is just something that I happen to have because I was feeding my Manakapurus with this food before, and I know that it works in terms of enhancing colors. Again, I don't think that is the best dry food for your Discus because it doesn't have insect component. For example, fluval bug bites and some other Discus foods, they have some insect component in them, so they would be probably more nutritionally preferable to your wild Discus than this. But the reason why I'm feeding this is because I need the red colors to pop up, I need the red spots to pop up, and they're still very young, so they need to have some sort of a color enhancing element in their diet. That's why I'm feeding them this. But I'm also feeding them fluval viper bites. So normally next throughout the day I will feed them with some frozen foods, and right now I'm feeding them with frozen brine shrimp, but you can also feed them with frozen Daphne or frozen Mysis shrimp. So there's lots of different other frozen foods, high quality frozen foods that have all the necessary proteins and vitamins for your wild Discus, and they love frozen foods, they love frozen brine shrimp, and next feeding will be with frozen brine shrimp. Occasionally I also give them some frozen bloodworms. Well, I know there is a lot of myths about the bad effect that bloodworm have on discus, but most of that is not exactly accurate because they feed on a red mosquito larvae in nature. It's not the same species of mosquito larvae as a bloodworm we have for sale, but it's a similar one. So occasionally it's good to give them treats of bloodworms. That's what I do, but it should not be their main form of food. They shouldn't be the main part of their diet. And their last feeding will be with their most favorite food, freeze-dried Australian blackworms. This is actually very protein-rich and very nutrients-rich food. It has high content of vitamin D, and that's what most of our fish need, and they also absolutely love it. That's certainly their most favorite food. So this will be their last feeding for the day, freeze-dried blackworms. So this is what I currently feed my wild discus, but I'm not saying that this is the most correct or appropriate diet for your case. You might choose different types of foods, but the most important thing to keep in mind is to diversify their diet as much as possible. So it's preferable if you combine dry foods with frozen foods, with freeze-dried foods, instead of just feeding them with one homemade mix, beef heart or fish food based mix, but something that has a diversity and something that has most comprehensive vitamin content that your discus need. Well, if you have younger fish like I have here, you would probably want to feed them more actively, and you want to feed them additionally. Sometimes apart from these three feedings, I would also give them additional frozen brine shrimp because they need more food to grow faster. If you have adult fish, and previously I mostly had adult wild discus, I would feed them less frequently and I would feed them less in general because they're already grown up, they're already in full color, they don't really need color enhancing foods, and they don't need that much food either. So it depends on what age fish you have and whether you actually want to work on their colors. So just to summarize, one thing you need to keep in mind that almost always the wild discus that you would buy has already been used to dry foods. So it's good if you will continue this tradition and if you will continue feeding them dry foods, which is easier for you. Also, it's better for your discus. Alright, so I hope this video was useful. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section. If you haven't subscribed yet, definitely click that subscribe button, and I will see you soon.